I'll never forget the sound of 1,000 German children cheering as my C-54 Skymaster roared overhead at barely 300 feet, candy parachutes streaming from the cargo door like confetti from heaven. It was September 22nd, 1948, and I was First Lieutenant Gale Thrice-Holm Halverson, 17th Troop Carrier Squadron, flying what would become known as Vorpar's Operation Little Vittles, though we just called it the right thing to do. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the sweet aroma of chocolate bars and chewing gum filled the cockpit as we made our approach to Tempelhof Airport in the heart of blockaded Berlin. What started as a simple gesture to a handful of hungry kids would become something that changed not just their lives but mine, and maybe even the course of history itself. The morning had started like any other during the Berlin airlift. I was checking my flight manifest, 10 tons of coal, 5 tons of flour, 2 tons of medical supplies, when Captain Morrison came running up to our aircraft. "Hal, you got clearance for your candy drop today. Command says the press is going to be there, so don't screw this up." That was typical Morrison, always worried about the brass and the newspapers. But what he didn't understand was that this wasn't about publicity or politics. This was about keeping a promise to some kids who had reminded me what hope looked like. I grabbed my flight bag and did my pre-flight inspection of our Spirit of Freedom, the same C-54 I'd been flying since the airlift started 3 months ago. She was a workhorse, 4 Pratt & Whitney R2000 engines that could haul 10 tons of cargo into Berlin and back out again, day after day, in weather that would ground lesser aircraft. Her aluminum skin was scarred from flak damage during the war, patched and repainted, but still bearing the marks of battles fought in different skies. The aircraft had originally been built in 1944 for the Army Air Forces, had flown supply missions over the hump into China, and had been converted for cargo duty after the war ended. Inside the cargo hold, alongside the usual supplies, were dozens of small parachutes made from handkerchiefs, each one carrying chocolate bars, chewing gum, and candy that my crew and I had bought with our own money. My crew chief, Sergeant Mike O'Brien from Boston, had spent the previous evening carefully packing each parachute, making sure the candy was secure and the strings were the right length for a safe descent. My radio operator, Corporal Danny Rodriguez from San Antonio, had contributed his entire month's candy ration to the cause. The flight to Berlin took us over the devastated landscape of post-war Germany. From 8,000 feet, I could see the scars that 4 years of war had left on the countryside. Bombed-out factories with their roofs caved in and walls standing like broken teeth against the sky. Destroyed bridges spanning rivers where the twisted metal girders reached toward each other but no longer met. Entire cities reduced to rubble, with only the occasional church spire or factory smokestack rising above the devastation like monuments to a world that no longer existed. But it was the people that got to me. Long lines of refugees walking along the roads, carrying everything they owned in suitcases and bundles, heading toward an uncertain future in a divided country. From our altitude, they looked like ants, but I knew each one represented a human story of loss, displacement, and hope for something better. These were the displaced persons, the DPs, millions of Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, concentration camp survivors, former prisoners of war, all trying to find a place in a world that had been turned upside down. I'd been flying the Berlin airlift since June 26, 1948, 2 days after the Soviets had cut off all land access to West Berlin. Stalin thought he could starve the city into submission, force the Western Allies to abandon their sectors, and leave 2.5 million Germans to communist rule. Instead, we were flying around the clock, bringing in everything the city needed to survive: food, fuel, medicine, hope. The blockade had started gradually. First, the Soviets claimed they needed to repair the Autobahn and the railway lines leading into Berlin. Then they said the bridges were unsafe. Finally, on June 24th, they cut off all land and water access to the western sectors of the city. No trucks, no trains, no barges, nothing. The only way in or out was through 3 narrow air corridors that had been established by the Four-Power Agreement after the war. The airlift was the largest humanitarian operation in history up to that point. Every 3 minutes, another transport plane landed at one of Berlin's airports: Tempelhof in the American sector, Gartow in the British sector, and later Tegel, which the French built from scratch in their sector. C-54s like mine, British Yorks and Hastings, even some old C-47s pressed back into service. We were flying in weather that would have grounded commercial aviation, navigating through narrow air corridors, while Soviet fighters buzzed us and ground controllers tried to jam our radio frequencies. The statistics were staggering. At the peak of the operation, we were flying over 1,400 flights per day, delivering 12,840 tons of supplies in a single 24-hour period. The planes were taking off and landing every 30 seconds during peak hours. We had established a precision operation that would have made a Swiss watchmaker proud. Aircraft following exact flight paths, maintaining precise altitudes and speeds, landing at predetermined intervals. I'd seen plenty of war during my time in the Pacific, flying C-46 over the hump into China. I'd dodged Japanese fighters, flown through monsoons that could tear an airplane apart, landed on airstrips that were little more than dirt roads carved out of jungle. But this was different. This wasn't about defeating an enemy. This was about saving people who had been our enemies just 3 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Many of the pilots flying the airlift had bombed German cities during the war. I myself had flown B-24 missions over Germany in 1944, dropping bombs on the same city I was now trying to keep alive. The Germans we were helping had shot at us, had tried to kill us, had celebrated when our planes went down in flames. Now we were risking our lives to bring them food and fuel. The whole candy drop idea had started 2 weeks earlier, on September 8th. I'd finished my cargo delivery at Tempelhof and had some time before my return flight, so I decided to walk around the airport perimeter. The weather was typical for Berlin in early September, overcast and cool, with a hint of the harsh winter that was coming. The city still bore the scars of the war everywhere you looked. Buildings with walls blown out, revealing the intimate details of people's lives. A kitchen table still set for dinner. A child's bedroom with toys scattered on the floor. A piano sitting in what had once been a living room, but was now open to the sky. That's when I saw them. About 30 German children ranging in age from maybe 6 to 14, standing at the chain-link fence that separated the airport from the surrounding neighborhood. They weren't begging or asking for anything, just watching with the kind of quiet fascination that kids have for airplanes. Their clothes were patched and mended, obviously hand-me-downs or made from whatever fabric their mothers could find. Some of them were wearing shoes that were too big or too small, stuffed with newspaper or held together with string. I walked over to the fence and started talking to them in my broken German, supplemented with hand gestures and the universal language of smiles. Most of them spoke a little English. Kids pick up languages fast, especially when survival depends on it. What struck me immediately was their dignity. These were children who had lived through the bombing of Berlin, who had seen their city destroyed, their fathers killed or captured, their mothers struggling to find food and shelter. But they weren't bitter or angry. They were just kids, curious about the big American planes and the men who flew them. "Why do you watch the planes?" I asked a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her name was Greta, and she had blonde pigtails tied with strips of cloth instead of ribbons, and eyes that seemed too old for her face. "Because they bring hope," she said, in careful English, pronouncing each word slowly and precisely. "When we see the planes, we know we will not starve." That hit me harder than any flak burst I'd ever flown through. Here was a child who understood better than most adults what our mission really meant. I reached into my pocket and pulled out 2 sticks of double mint gum, all I had with me. I broke them in half and passed the pieces through the fence to the kids closest to me. What happened next still gives me chills. The 4 kids who got gum didn't just pop it in their mouths. Instead, they carefully unwrapped it and passed it around to all 30 kids, letting each one smell the sweet mint scent. Then they rewrapped it and gave it back to the original 4. They were sharing even the smell of that gum, making sure everyone got something. "So tomorrow," I told them, "I'll drop candy from my plane. Watch for the plane that wiggles its wings. That'll be me." The next day, I made my regular supply run to Tempelhof, and as I approached the airport, I could see the kids gathered at the fence. I waggled my wings as promised, a dangerous maneuver at low altitude that could have gotten me court-martialed if the wrong person had seen it, then dropped 3 small parachutes made from handkerchiefs, each carrying chocolate bars and gum that my crew had contributed. The kids went wild, cheering and jumping up and down as they watched the parachutes drift down. But something unexpected happened. Word spread through the city like wildfire. The next day, there were 60 kids at the fence. The day after that, over 100. Soon, children were coming from all over Berlin, walking miles through the rubble-strewn streets to watch for the Mutt candy bomber. The letters started arriving at our base within a week, hundreds of them, written in careful English or translated by older siblings and teachers. They came addressed to Varn the Chocolate Pilot, her Uncle Wiggly Wings, and Varn the Candy Man. Each letter told a story that broke my heart and filled it at the same time. One letter from a boy named Klaus read, "Dear Chocolate Pilot, my little sister has not smiled since our father was killed in the bombing. Yesterday, when your candy fell from the sky, she laughed for the first time in 2 years. Thank you for giving me back my sister's smile." Another from a girl named Ingrid. "Dear Uncle Wiggly Wings, I am saving the chocolate you dropped for my mother. She has not had anything sweet since before the war. I want to surprise her on her birthday next week. She cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not watching, but I think your chocolate will make her happy." The most heartbreaking came from a teenage boy named Hans. "Dear American Pilot, I wanted to hate you. My brother was killed by American bombs during the war, but when I saw you dropping candy for the little children, I remembered that my brother loved chocolate too. Maybe if there had been more people like you during the war, my brother would still be alive. Thank you for showing me that enemies can become friends." By the 3rd week, my unofficial candy drops had become a phenomenon. The press had picked up the story, and newspapers across America were running headlines about the Nemesis candy bomber. The Associated Press ran a story that was picked up by papers from coast to coast. Life magazine sent a photographer to document the drops. Radio stations were interviewing me via shortwave from Berlin. Donations started pouring in from all over the United States. Chocolate companies sending cases of candy bars, children mailing their allowance money, church groups organizing candy drives. The Hershey Company donated 3,000 chocolate bars. Mars sent cases of candy. Wrigley contributed thousands of packs of chewing gum. But it wasn't just the big companies. It was ordinary Americans who were moved by the story of German children catching candy from American planes. An elementary school class in Cheyenne, Wyoming, sent their entire Halloween candy collection. A women's club in Portland, Oregon, organized a candy drive that collected over 500 pounds of sweets. A group of Boy Scouts in Alabama spent their weekends making parachutes from old bedsheets and handkerchiefs. Even prisoners at a federal penitentiary in Kansas pooled their commissary money to buy candy for the German children. But it was the response from my fellow air crews that really moved me. Pilots and loadmasters from other squadrons started contributing their own candy and gum. Some of them began making their own drops, until we had a whole fleet of Shark candy bombers operating throughout the airlift. The ground crews at our base in Wiesbaden started volunteering their off-duty time to help make parachutes and pack candy. Captain Jack Pickering, who flew the route right after mine, started dropping candy over the British sector. Lieutenant Bob Williams began targeting the French sector. Soon we had coordinated drops happening all over West Berlin, with children gathering at predetermined locations to watch for their favorite pilots. The operation grew so large that it eventually got official recognition and the codename ITAS Operation Little Vittles. But to us, it was never about the official designation or the publicity. It was about those kids at the fence, about the letters that kept coming, about the chance to show that Americans weren't just warriors, but healers, not just conquerors, but friends. General Lucius Clay, the military governor of the American zone in Germany, initially had reservations about the candy drops. He was concerned about maintaining military discipline and worried that the Soviets might use the operation for propaganda purposes. But when he saw the positive response from the German population and the boost to American morale, he gave the operation his full support. "These candy drops are worth more than a dozen propaganda broadcasts," he told me during a visit to our base. "They're showing the German people what America really stands for, not just military might, but compassion and generosity." The day I'll never forget was September 22nd, when we made what would be our largest candy drop yet. Intelligence had told us that over 5,000 children were expected to gather at various locations around Berlin to watch for our planes. We had prepared over 3,000 candy parachutes, each one carefully packed by volunteers back at the base. The preparation had taken weeks. We had established drop zones throughout West Berlin, coordinating with the British and French authorities to make sure we didn't interfere with their operations. We had worked out a system of colored parachutes to identify different types of candy: white for chocolate bars, red for gum, blue for hard candy. We had even recruited German volunteers to help distribute the candy fairly among the children. As we approached Berlin that morning, I could see them from miles away. Thousands of tiny figures gathered in parks, schoolyards, and open spaces throughout the city. The sight took my breath away. These weren't just the kids from Tempelhof anymore. This was an entire generation of German children who had learned to associate American aircraft with hope instead of fear, with candy instead of bombs. We made our first drop over Tempelhof, where it all started. As the candy parachutes streamed out of our cargo door, the sound that rose from the ground was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Thousands of children cheering, screaming with joy, jumping up and down as they watched the colorful parachutes drift down like snow in summer. "Jesus, Hallherr," said my co-pilot, Lieutenant Jimmy Morrison, the captain's younger brother. "Look at them, they're going absolutely crazy down there." From our altitude of 300 feet, I could see individual faces in the crowd. Kids with their arms raised to the sky. Mothers crying as they watched their children experience pure joy. Elderly Germans who remembered when American planes brought death instead of candy. Some of the adults were crying too, and I realized that for many of them, this was the first time since the war that they had seen their children truly happy. We made 6 more drops that day, covering different areas of the city. Each time, the response was the same. Pure, unbridled joy from children who had known too much sorrow for their young lives. At one drop zone near the Brandenburg Gate, I saw something that will stay with me forever. A group of older German men, probably veterans of the Wehrmacht, standing at attention and saluting our plane as we passed overhead. "They're saluting us," Jimmy said, his voice thick with emotion. "German soldiers are saluting an American bomber." That's when it really hit me what we were doing. We weren't just dropping candy. We were dropping hope. We were showing an entire generation of German children that Americans could be friends, not just enemies. We were proving that former adversaries could work together, that the cycle of hatred and revenge could be broken. The letters that came after that day were different. They weren't just thank you notes anymore. They were expressions of friendship, of hope for the future, of dreams that transcended the political divisions that had torn Europe apart. One letter from a teacher named Frau Müller read, "Dear Candy Pilots, I have been teaching for 20 years and I have never seen anything like what happened yesterday. Children who have been silent and withdrawn since the war ended were laughing and playing again. You have given us something more precious than candy. You have given us back our children's childhood." Another from a mother named Gisela. "From my son Peter is 8 years old. He was born during the war and has never known anything but fear and hunger. Yesterday, when he caught one of your candy parachutes, he asked me if this meant the war was really over. I told him yes, and for the first time, I believed it myself. But perhaps the most moving letter came from an unexpected source. A former Luftwaffe pilot named Werner, who had been shot down over England in 1943 and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. He wrote, "I flew against your bombers during the war. I shot down American planes and watched good men die. I thought I would hate Americans forever. But when I saw my daughter's face yesterday as she caught chocolate from an American plane, I realized that we are all just human beings trying to take care of the people we love. Thank you for showing me that yesterday's enemies can be tomorrow's friends." The candy drops continued for months, eventually expanding to include other cities in the American sector. We dropped over 23 tons of candy and gum, supported by donations from all across America. Children sent their allowance money, candy companies donated their products, and housewives spent their evenings making parachutes from handkerchiefs and bedsheets. But the real impact went far beyond the candy itself. What we were doing was changing hearts and minds, building bridges between former enemies, showing that Americans were capable of compassion as well as conquest. The children who caught our candy grew up with a different view of America than their parents had. They became the foundation of the strong German-American alliance that would help win the Cold War. One of the most remarkable developments was the response from German children in the Soviet sector of Berlin. Even though they couldn't receive our candy drops directly, they found ways to send us letters, smuggled across the sector boundaries by relatives and friends. These letters were heartbreaking in their simplicity and hope. "As dear Candy Pilot," wrote a boy named Friedrich from East Berlin, "I cannot come to see your plane because the soldiers will not let me cross the line. But my cousin told me about the chocolate that falls from the sky. Someday, when there are no more lines between people, I hope I can taste American chocolate too." The Soviet authorities tried to counter our candy drops with propaganda. telling children in their sector that the Americans were trying to poison them with capitalist candy. They distributed leaflets claiming that the chocolate was contaminated, that the Americans were using the candy to spread disease and corruption among German youth. But the message wasn't getting through. Children could see the joy on the faces of their friends in West Berlin, could hear the laughter and cheering that echoed across the divided city every time our planes appeared. As the months passed, the candy drops became a symbol of something larger than just humanitarian aid. They represented the American approach to the Cold War, not just military strength, but the power of kindness, generosity, and hope. While the Soviets ruled through fear and oppression, we were winning hearts and minds with chocolate bars and chewing gum. The psychological impact was enormous. German adults who had been skeptical of American intentions began to see us differently. The same planes that had bombed their cities during the war were now bringing food to keep them alive and candy to make their children smile. It was a powerful demonstration of American values, that we could be tough when necessary, but generous when possible. The Berlin airlift officially ended on September 30th, 1949, after 462 days of continuous operations. We had delivered over 2.3 million tons of supplies to keep Berlin alive and free. But for me, the real victory wasn't measured in tons of cargo. It was measured in the smiles of children who had learned to love instead of hate. My last candy drop was on September 29th, 1949, the day before the airlift ended. As I approached Tempelhof for the final time, I could see that the crowd was even larger than usual. Word had spread that this would be the last drop, and it seemed like half of Berlin had turned out to say goodbye. As the candy parachute streamed out of my plane for the last time, the sound from the ground was different. Along with the cheering and laughter, I could hear something else, singing. Thousands of German children were singing Auf Wiedersehen, the traditional German farewell song. Even from 300 feet up, I could see that many of them were crying. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of friendship, of hope for the future. As I banked my plane for the final time over Berlin, I saw something that summed up everything we had accomplished. A group of children had arranged themselves in the shape of a heart in one of the parks, and in the center of the heart, they had spelled out of Danke, thank you. After the airlift ended, I returned to the United States, but I never forgot the children of Berlin. Over the years, I received thousands of letters from kids who had caught my candy, telling me about their lives, their dreams, their hopes for the future. Many of them grew up to become teachers, doctors, engineers, and leaders in the new democratic Germany. The impact of the candy drops extended far beyond the immediate recipients. The children who caught the candy told their friends, who told their friends, creating a ripple effect that spread throughout German society. Parents who had been bitter about the war began to see Americans differently. Teachers incorporated the story of the candy bombers into their lessons about friendship and reconciliation. In 1970, 21 years after the airlift ended, I returned to Berlin for the first time. The city had been rebuilt, transformed from a pile of rubble into a thriving metropolis. The Berlin Wall now divided the city, a concrete reminder of the Cold War that was still raging. But what moved me most was meeting some of the children who had caught my candy, now adults with children of their own. Greta, the little girl with pigtails who had told me that planes brought hope, was now a teacher herself. She introduced me to her own daughter, a bright-eyed 8-year-old who looked remarkably like her mother had all those years ago. I tell her about the candy pilot, Greta said, about how you taught us that former enemies can become friends. She doesn't really understand yet what it was like during the blockade, but she understands that kindness is more powerful than hatred. Klaus, the boy whose sister had smiled for the first time when she saw the candy drop, had become a doctor. You saved more than my sister's smiles, he told me. You saved her faith in humanity. She grew up believing that people are basically good, that even in the darkest times, there are those who choose to help rather than harm. Hans, the teenager who had wanted to hate Americans because of his brother's death, had become a diplomat, working to strengthen German-American relations. You changed the course of my life, he said. Instead of growing up with hatred in my heart, I learned that the best way to honor my brother's memory was to work for peace. But perhaps the most moving reunion was with Werner, the former Luftwaffe pilot, who had written about watching his daughter catch chocolate from an American plane. He had become a commercial pilot after the war, flying for Lufthansa, and had spent his career building bridges between Germany and the rest of the world. "My daughter is a pilot now too," he told me with pride. "She flies for the same airline I did, and she always tells her passengers about the day she caught chocolate from the sky. She says it taught her that flying is about bringing people together, not tearing them apart." The impact of Operation Little Vittles extended far beyond Berlin, far beyond Germany. The story of the candy bombers became a symbol of American generosity and compassion around the world. During the Korean War, American pilots began dropping candy to Korean children. During the Vietnam War, some units adopted similar programs. The idea that military power could be used for humanitarian purposes, that former enemies could become friends, became part of American foreign policy doctrine. But for me, the real legacy of the candy drops wasn't political or strategic, it was personal. Those children taught me that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is kindness, that the most effective way to defeat an enemy is to turn them into a friend. They showed me that even in the darkest times, there is always hope, always the possibility of redemption and reconciliation. In 1998, 50 years after the Berlin airlift, I returned to Germany one more time for a commemoration ceremony. The Berlin Wall had fallen, Germany was reunited, and the city that had once been divided by barbed wire and concrete was whole again. At the ceremony, I was introduced to a group of children from a Berlin elementary school who had prepared a special presentation about the candy bombers. One little girl, probably about the same age as Greta had been in 1948, stepped forward and handed me a chocolate bar. "This is for you," she said in perfect English. "Yes, because my grandmother told me that you gave chocolate to children when they needed hope. Now we want to give chocolate to you to say thank you." As I looked at that little girl, I saw the future that we had helped create with our candy drops. A future where German and American children could be friends, where former enemies could work together, where the lessons of the past could guide us toward a better tomorrow. That moment changed everything for me. I'd started dropping candy to keep a promise to some hungry kids at an airport fence. But what I discovered was that in giving them hope, they had given me something even more precious. They had shown me the power of human kindness to overcome any obstacle, to heal any wound, to bridge any divide. This was the story of First Lieutenant Gail Arfhaulers Hulk Halvorsen, 17th Troop Carrier Squadron, who turned a simple gesture of kindness into one of the most successful humanitarian operations in military history. His candy drops during the Berlin airlift reached over 250,000 German children and helped transform former enemies into lifelong allies. Halvorsen's experience, documented in his memoir, Mauerstand, the Berlin Candy Bomber, and preserved in the archives of the Berlin Airlift Historical Foundation, demonstrates how individual acts of compassion can have far-reaching consequences. The children who caught his candy grew up to become leaders in the new democratic Germany, many of them crediting their positive view of America to that first taste of chocolate that fell from the sky. The Candy Bomber program became a model for humanitarian operations around the world, proving that military aircraft could deliver hope as effectively as they could deliver destruction. The program's success helped establish the principle that former enemies could become friends through acts of kindness and mutual respect. What struck you most about Lieutenant Halvorsen's story? Have you heard similar accounts of military personnel using their position to spread hope rather than fear? These personal stories remind us that even in the midst of global conflicts, individual choices to show kindness can change the course of history. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Captain Maria Santos, a Navy nurse who helped establish field hospitals in post-war Japan, and how her work healing former enemies helped lay the foundation for one of America's strongest alliances. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories of turning swords into plowshares, or in this case, bombers into candy deliverers, live on.